su dinero. Para serte muy sincero, el Estado no responde por el pueblo obrero, y el oro nada vale sin nada que lo avale. Somos el pueblo unido y no habrá nada que nos pare. Esa es la revolución de mis hermanos y mis padres. Quieren matar la tierra donde vieron el águila entre los nopales. Wakamatikan, Nintotla, Amumonemaka, Tlakit Negedualas, Makitakan Kenika, Amunikawas Makalakikan, Nika Matachistonikan, Amusante Juan, Noche Latinoamérica, Makakikan, Noche Nindotlator, Noche Ninikitos, y Noche Nintokniwan indígenas,
Sakarik ronoh elalak, sakarit katat kanan, alah, alitom, alitomap, utsiliwech konohel reach kochiri, kamik parihu lahuj akabal. Welcome everybody to this Rhizome Fellowship call opening session and introduction. My name is Andrea Ischu. I am a Maya Quiche woman from Highlands, Totonicapán in Guatemala. I'm an Ajkij, a land defender, a communicator, and educator with over 20 years of experience developing narrative strategies to protect indigenous lives and territories. And I'm also the co-director of Culture Hack Labs. So I am very happy to welcome you all in this morning that I was sharing in my mother tongue, Maya Quiche. We are celebrating today the accompaniment of the energy of Hulna Juja Cabal. So for our culture today is a day that we honor when the sun rises, but also the dawn and the dusk. And it's an important day for us to welcome you all to become part of this Rhizome Fellowship, to share about what narratives for systems change are, and also to share with you some of the work we have been developing for a few years. Today, the session will be focused on sharing about Culture Hack Labs and our journey in this world. So I welcome you all, and I hope you enjoyed this session. And also to not forget that this is the first session of a couple of sessions where we are going to share more details on the Rhizome Fellowship. So welcome, welcome, welcome.
In times of ecocide and genocide, climate crisis and the rise of fascism, narratives can be pathways for systems change. The violence against the earth and its peoples is the outcome of hundreds of years of monocultures, narratives about who belongs, who decides, what has value, what counts as growth, and the endless bureaucracy of the self. These systems of meaning were imposed, and they can be dismantled. The rhizome is an underground structure connecting root to root, decentralizing knowledge, a web of life. Is the metaphor and the strategy, a global network of narrative practitioners dedicated to challenge the assumptions of capitalist modernity and cultivating new, ancient, and emerging narratives, pathways for regenerative futures. These pathways emerge from a deep questioning in a time where change is measuring metrics, likes, carbon capture, tokens of techno-optimism, and market-driven solutions, while oppressive structures remain intact. True regeneration requires interwoven conditions for systems change: justice, economics, governance, land, and spirit. Change is a pathway, not an outcome. If you're a narrative practitioner, storyteller, land defender, artist, hacker, researcher, ready to challenge the dominant systems, the rhizome is for you.
So today, the structure of the call will be sharing with you some of the story of Culture Hack, share with you what is the narrative-led systems change and our theory of change. We're going to navigate through what is the Culture Hack method and a very brief introduction on the pathways for regenerative futures and our research processes. So this will be our structure for this morning. And I pass it on into my mates to continue to present our introduction and stories.
It's your turn.
Well, to share a bit about our story as a culture hack organization is, a brief genealogy of our method. Culture Hack Labs grew out from the Rules, an activist collective that operated from 2012 to 2019. The Rules brought together activists, writers, researchers, artists, hackers, and technologists from across the global majority to address the root causes of inequality, poverty, and ecological breakdown, not through policy reform alone, but through narrative and cultural intervention. So during 8 years, the rules pioneered a multidisciplinary approach that merged data analytics, cognitive linguistics, memetics, anthropology, complexity science, and movement organizing to understand how dominant narratives about growth, development, property progress sustain the system that we want to transform. So out of that decade, a practice, experimentation, and direct accompaniment into social movements, Culture Hack Labs was formalized as a not for profit consultancy, inheriting the rules, core insight, and refining it into our more replicable methodology. So, the Culture Hack method is a 5 phase cycle that we're gonna share with you more in depth, but that has meant a journey for several years. So, what distinguished Culture Hack's approach it is rootedness. The method was not developed in a lab or a university. It was forged through direct collaboration within indigenous movements, land defenders, feminist collectives, and frontline communities. So, from the Brazilian Amazon to Mesoamerica, from the US Mexico border to the Caribbean, each hack has represented not just projects but living iterations of our method, shaped by communities, territories, and political movements where they were born. Culture Hack operated as a decentralized network with a post-capitalist lens, working exclusively with social movements and progressive organizations, and also freely sharing its research and tools. So our framework for narrative-led system change insists in dual shift towards justice and relational ontologies as other ways of living and existing. So we want to share with you some of the good hacks that we have gone in the past years. So in 2018, the Mexican government pushed forward the largest mega infrastructure project in Latin America, a new international airport to be built on the ancient lake of Texcoco, but at the east of Mexico City. So Culture Hack Labs work alongside a coalition of Nahua and Alcoa communities and environmental organizations defending the lake, an ecologically vital wetland and a territory of very deep cultural significance. So using the Culture Hack method, the intervention reframed the public debate. Instead of technical arguments about infrastructure, the campaign was centering the voices of the lake itself and asked a question that resonated far beyond the affected community. What good is economic growth when life itself is being destroyed? So the campaign reliably cry "Yo prefiero el lago" or "I prefer the lake," and that became a powerful counter-narrative. Through community organizing, filmmaking, strategically and cultural production, the action helped shift public discourse during a national consultation and ultimately contributing to the cancellation of the airport project. It remains foundational case study for culture hack methodology, and also it is a proof that when narrative is rooted in community organizing can alter the course of mega projects. Then we jumped from Mexico to Central America into Guatemala, my motherland. During Guatemala's 2019 presidential elections, Culture Hack Lab collaborated with a coalition of organizations seeking to make visible the structural racism and extractivism embedded into the Guatemalan state. So the intervention accompanied the candidacy of Telma Cabrera, a Maya Mam land defender who ran for president, a very unprecedented event in a country where indigenous peoples, the demographic majority, have been systemically excluded from political power. So Elijo Dignidad, or I Choose Dignity, was a narrative action that reframed the electoral conversation away from the usual menu of corrupt establishment options and toward the possibility of indigenous leadership rooted in territorial defense, collective governance, and dignity. So this hack demonstrated that electoral moments can also be used as stages for deep narrative disruption, not just as partisan campaigning. Then we were invited and called into the Amazon River Basin. In 2020, in Brazil, in January, just before pandemic, indigenous women from the 14 major tribal nations of the Brazilian Amazon, spanning the Amazonia, Cerrado, Pantanal, the Pampa, Catatinga, and Mata Atlántica biomes, gather at a historic encounter in Xingu and issue a call. The earth is sick and it must be healed. When the COVID-19 pandemic hit weeks later, Culture Hack responded by amplifying the voices of the women in the territory through a global cultural intervention named Cura da Terra, or Cure of the Earth, that became an indigenous women-led initiative to co-create narratives of responsibility, reciprocity, and regeneration in times of systems collapse. So we supported the co-organization of a global gathering of more of 300 indigenous women and produced some documentary series featuring leaders like Watata Kalu, Celia Chacriabá, Sonia Guajajara, and other amazing fellows. The project demonstrated that in moments of planetary crisis, the most transformative narratives do not come from institutions and experts. They come from the communities that have been defending the lives for centuries. And that conversation opened a path, the path of Futuros Indígenas in Mesoamerica in 2021. Indigenous Futures emerged from a collaboration with land defenders from multiple indigenous nations across the Americas. At the height of global climate negotiation, dominated by technocratic solutions and a lot of carbon market language, this intervention sought the center and to center the voices of communities that are already practicing what the world claims to be searching for, living solutions to the climate crisis, but rooted in territorial defense, food sovereignty, and ancestral knowledge. So this hack co-created narratives that position indigenous peoples as protagonists of transition holders of practices, governance systems, and relational ontologies that point toward viable futures. So Futuros Indígenas grew into an ongoing network and platform, extending Culture Hack method into a self-sustaining movement infrastructure across our region. So right after that, in 2023, back to the land in Turtle Island, Milpa America, and the Pacific Islands, well, we gather land defenders from Guam, Hawaii, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, Alaska, Canada, the United States, Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador at the Territories of Transition Narrative Lab, where we wanted to hack the dominant narrative for land ownership. The result was Back to the Land, a collective call to evolve the land back conversation toward what we call and frame as land back right relations, shifting from a justice claim rooted in property redistribution toward a deeper ontological shift that land is not just a property at all, but a living relation. So, a narrative council produced by the indigenous land defenders that came produced 10 guiding principles and launched a set of narrative actions that are part of this way of changing dual framework, the justice and ontol transformation woven together through community regenerated narrative. Right into 2024, 2025, the pathway for regenerative futures and beyond the carbon fixation was a process of research that represent an evolution of our previous two narrative investigations that were post-capitalist philanthropy and land back to right relations, synthesizing insights and interviewing with key actors across the bioregional governments, land back, ecocide law, and regenerative economic movements. So this work maps the public discourse around land ownership, land-based transitions beyond the meta crisis, and identifying where existing narrative cluster in terms of capacity for justice and ontological shift. So this was a process that was helping us to move beyond carbon fixation as a dominant frame for environmental action toward narratives that recognize sovereignty of living systems. And between 2022 and 2026, one of our most beloved spaces, the Rhizome Fellowship. So this is Culture Hack flagship capacity building program. It's a 9-month journey designed to equip narrative practitioners, artists, journalists, activists working at the intersection of culture change and regenerative solutions with the tools and frameworks of narrative-led systems change. So each cohort forms a leading community that moves through the Culture Hack method while developing their own narrative interventions in their territories and movements. Now it's our 4th cycle. So this fellowship has cultivated a growing network of practitioners around America, Africa, Europe, Asia, Pacific, creating a living rhizome, and our underground root system of interconnected narrative capacity that is extending culture hack methodology very far beyond what any single organization could reach alone. And I am very happy and pleased to share with you a bit of our journey in the past years. And now I pass it on to my mate, Tiffany.
Hi everyone, my name is Tiffany and it's such a pleasure to have you all here learning more about the fellowship and our work. And I'm from the UK and based in Berlin, and I'm an anthropologist and researcher. And at Culture Hack, I work developing the methods and with the Rhizome Fellowship, and also as a researcher for narrative projects we have. And beyond Culture Hack, I'm also working as an artist in documentary filmmaking and dance. So I'm really excited to hear more about all your projects. So we're going to dive in a little bit deeper into what narrative-led systems change actually is. And on the next slide, we have a little definition of systems. So systems can be found across ecological, social, and economic domains, shaping and being shaped by dynamic interactions. They're groups of actors and materials that are coordinated in a purposeful way and have inputs, processes, and outputs. And for the kind of nerds who want to read more about this, our understanding on a theoretical level is based in systems theory, complexity science, and evolutionary theory. And on the next slide, you see our definition of narratives, interpretive social structures that frame our experience and help us make sense of everyday reality. And we'll dive into what narratives actually are in a bit, but it's worth highlighting just two parts now. That one, narratives, they frame what we see, and two, they guide what we do. So they also have these material behavioral effects. And much of this happens on an unconscious level. And again, for the nerds who want to read more, our theoretical understanding is rooted in the field of embodied cognition. So, narrative-led systems change. The core idea here is when you change the narrative, you change the system. So in other words, by shifting these narratives, our shared cognitive maps, our beliefs, our values, the stories that sustain a certain system, we can then redefine what is possible and ultimately reshape the system itself. And just to give you a bit of context to make sure we're all on the same page about the culture of the Anthropocene. So we are in the midst of a meta-crisis. And at its core is a crisis of culture. We're living in this culture of the Anthropocene. And just a quick note on what we actually define as culture. Culture, we see the values, belief systems, and ontologies that drive human behavior. Culture shapes how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to each other, and how we relate to the network of life. And our current growth-driven capitalist culture, particularly now in its neoliberal phase, it commodifies life, it reinforces separation and exploitation. And we have a little 2-minute video we'd love to show you on the next slide to just go over some of these symptoms of the culture of the Anthropocene.
The Anthropocene is the most recent period in Earth's history, when human activity has had a significant impact on the planet's climate and ecosystems. The Anthropocene can be seen as the host of consequences that derive of othering nature, people, and living beings in favor of the greed of a few. But is it a symptom or a disease? The current compounding crisis related to destructive human behaviors and social activity have roots in structural inequalities, cultural belief systems, and dominant narratives. What is the origin of this culture? Why are we here? What else is possible? We invite you to understand and confront the underlying worldviews that gave birth to the Western monoculture. These include capitalism, neoliberalism, patriarchy, white supremacy, colonialism, enclosure, enslavement, genocide, extraction of the natural world, exploitation of human beings, and the more than human world. We invite you to dismantle the building blocks of the current systemic crisis. At Culture Hack, we explicitly, unapologetically root ourselves in life-affirming, life-valuing, structural and critical theory. Our methodology was built upon the understanding that our ultimate goal is to fundamentally shift the dominant cultural narratives that create, sustain, and perpetuate the Anthropocene. Living outside the Anthropocene requires allowing ourselves to imagine and design alternatives, ancient futures, systems, and societies, narratives that will give birth to the big transformation.
In the Anthropocene.
So I'm going to give you a little bit more information about how narratives function to create reality. And we use the metaphor of maps to understand how narratives function. On the next slide, you'll see that maps are like narratives. We use maps to orient ourselves within a territory so we can navigate it more effectively. And on the next slide, you can see that narratives or maps, they frame our raw experience or the territory to help us make sense of the world. And this provides the justification or the basis of our actions or behavior. For example, if the narrative here is nature is a resource or nature is a commodity, then we see a forest as being more valuable cut down. So this narrative really justifies extractive behavior like deforestation. And it's also worth mentioning that narratives are complex, adaptive, evolutionary systems. We really see narratives are alive. They're born, they can evolve, they can mutate, terminate, and converge with other narrative forms. And now you have a deeper understanding of what we mean by narratives. I want to introduce you to our distinct approach at Culture Hack Labs to narrative-led systems change. You can kind of see this as a theory of change. What we really want to do is disrupt the dominant narratives and develop these kind of new ancient narratives that enable justice plus ontological shift. So justice is really a change in structural inequality or inequity, and it's about dismantling systems of oppression. And then this fancy word ontology is really just a word for talking about the very ways we relate to each other, we view the world, we sense the world. So this idea of an ontological shift is a change in the very ways we know and we are, dismantling kind of monocultures of knowing and being. And our idea here, our theory of change, is that justice is an essential basis, but on its own, it is not enough. And to truly move beyond modernity or beyond the capitalist, colonialist, corporatist systems that we find ourselves in, new ontologies are essential. In other words, new languages, beliefs, worldviews, they're needed to shift how we understand our place in the web of life. So here you can see in the graph that we really want to move from kind of separation ontologies and monocultures of knowing and being, and kind of injustice, which is systems crisis. You see in the bottom left quadrant, and we want to move with justice plus onto shift towards regenerative systems, where there's a change in structural inequity as well as a change in the very ways we view and relate to the world. And there's a beautiful quote from Bayo, the African philosopher and scholar, that demands for social justice may get us a seat at the table, but they will never let us leave the house of capitalist colonial modernity. And to leave the house of modernity, we really need new ontologies. So we thought this quote captures this theory of change quite beautifully. So now I'll pass to Aubrey to let us digest all of this cognitive load with a breath.
Thank you, Tiffany. My name's Aubrey Morgan Yee. I'm coming in from the occupied territory of Hawaii on the island of Oahu. I'm a futurist and a facilitator, and just really excited to have you all here. So let's take a moment, feel your feet on the floor, the ground, wherever you are, and close down your eyes, and just allow yourself to breathe and feel the depth of your breath. And really just take a moment to notice that you're in a room of hundreds of people with a shared desire for transformation on the planet. spanning all different territories and lands and cultures and languages. Just really feel the blessing of that right now. Feeling your breath going deeply into your belly. Knowing that we're all holding a piece of this movement towards new futures, life-affirming futures. With that commitment within yourself and this beautiful understanding that we're never alone in our work, let's take one deep breath in together. Really fill up your belly, feel it filling, and release. You can open your eyes, take a moment to see people who've shown up here, maybe scroll through the screen a little bit, see some of their faces, and I will pass off to my colleagues. I believe it's Fede now. Thank you so much.
Muchas gracias, Aubrey. So welcome, everybody. Thank you for being here to take this time of your precious life. And I am Federico. I come from Mexico. I've been working for many years with social movements and land resistances in Mesoamerica, but also in other parts of the world. In Culture Hack, I mainly am working on the rhizome and also in the creative process in general of Culture Hack Labs. So welcome, everybody. And I am going to talk a little bit about the culture hack method. And it's the method to create narrative actions for systems change. So now that Tiffany has already introduced why we think narratives are essential for systems change, I'm going to talk a little bit about how we do that through a methodology that we have developed in Culture Hack. The first thing to say is that this methodology is the work of many people during many years in many iterations, and it is an open source methodology. That means that it's open for you to use, to recreate, to reimagine, and to take the pieces that are useful for your work. And it was developed by land defenders, activists, journalists, academics, artists, and hackers to create narrative-led systems change. And even though it might seem a little bit technical, what I want to tell about the method is that it's kind of a bag of tools, right, that we have found during different years of practicing this communication and creating narratives in social movements. And you might actually see that you are already doing some of these different things of the methodology. And what we want to say is that people already have the knowledge to do this, and they don't need to be experts to actually start creating narratives that are powerful and that can change culture. But the methodology goes in this way. It has these 5 paths, right, that interweave, and they are not linear, but we kind of present it in this way because sometimes it's easier to enter in the first part, which is ask, which is where we actually co-create a point of view. So we collectively ask the correct questions to craft a statement or a manifesto that outlines the context and the intention of our narrative intervention, but also with the positionality of where we are working and where do we want to go. And from this step, a collective process is like the point of view is born, right? Which is a technical, but sometimes also poetical positionality about why we want to create this change. And then we go into the phase of listening, which is to identify narrative communities. So we transform that point of view into a listening model to explore the narrative space using big small listening, we identify the key narrative communities shaping the conversation on the chosen topic. So we are trying to find who is in this conversation, who is part of this conversation. But what we do is we don't do this like only saying, okay, there is a whole bunch of people out there, but rather we try to understand the nuances of the different actors that are part of this conversation. And that's why we create these narrative communities. And we do this through a process of language, also of power analysis. And when we get into that, we actually have the narrative communities. And we move to the understand phase, which is to map the capacity for change in the actual landscape or narrative landscape. So we map these narrative communities based on their attention network and power, and that reveals the acupuncture points in our audiences and the possibilities to shift the window of discourse. This mapping is the basis of the narrative strategy. And the mapping is basically what Tiffany has already showed you, right? Where are these narrative communities in this justice plus ontological shift axis? And once we map them, then we can see where is what we call the window of discourse, which is basically where people actually that things are possible, right? Uh, there is this quote that says it's easier for people to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism, right? What we want is to actually shift that. We want people to actually think on the end of capitalism before the end of the world. And that leads us to this fourth phase, which is the recode, where we reframe the narrative. We change the logics of what is already out there to go into our direction and with our specific plan, right? So we get practical and we define our audiences to set narrative objectives and begin the reframing process, which is decoding those hegemonic narratives and recoding them with to support our aims or our point of view. And from that process of reframing, then there we have now a narrative reframe, which is a narrative that has these logics, these values that we want to push out there in the world. And that's where we get finally to the final phase of this culture hack cycle, which is to seed culture change. And in this, with this reframe as a seed and the narrative strategy and the point of view as the guides, we enter into the creative process of reforesting the narrative landscape. And we will design and execute culture hackings, right? And this is where a lot of the creativity, but also the community organizing comes into hand. And we say that there is no change without community organizing, and there is no change without narrative change. So that's where both get together. And what comes after this is actually culture hacking, right? Sitting out there in the world, these possible communications, actions, narratives, storytelling, and many things that can create this change. And again, like this is a very important part of the culture hack method. It is not a linear thing, right? It's not like 5 steps for changing the world, but rather it is like a cycle of learning and understanding why narratives have impact in our world. So it is designed as a cycle of narrative actions and learnings. The hacks by themselves can be as small as a meme or as big as an international campaign, an app or a demonstration in the streets, a flash mob, or several years of movement building. Critical thinking and reiteration are key parts of this method. And as we said, the whole method is already open source and it's online, right now for you to go and get deeper into it if you want. But of course, what we are inviting everybody today is to join the Rhizome Fellowship, where you will get like this process of accompaniment through the whole narrative, culture hack narrative methodology, and you will get at the end into your hacks. But before that, we want to talk a little bit about why we are merging the rhizome process with these pathways for regenerative futures. And I'll pass the word to Aubrey and Yael.
Thank you, Fede. Yeah, so the pathways research is a core piece of the fellowship. We started this with the last cohort and found that it was really nourishing and regenerative to use this pathways research as the way we organize the projects. You can go to the next slide, Fede. So this is a case study and narrative brief that we call Beyond the Carbon Fixation in collaboration with one of our partners, Ma Earth. So we were looking at the question of what is really required, or what are the sort of the enabling conditions, the conditions of possibility for true regeneration to happen and regenerative futures to come into being. So with that question in mind, we can go to the next slide. Our intention was to find pathways to liberate land, water, ecosystems, and communities from the enclosures of capitalism and colonialism. And so in that regard, we engaged with lots of different stakeholders, lots of our partners who are doing this work to understand the narrative landscape about regeneration. And what we found was that true regeneration, it goes beyond a lot of, the rhetoric and the narrative around carbon. And carbon is sort of like the key, and really to see that there is a multifaceted, holistic approach to regeneration that requires a networked, rhizomatic, mycelial approach to thinking about what is needed to tend place, tend territory, work with land to create true, lasting, systemic regeneration. So this is recognizing the social, economic, cultural dimensions, a much more holistic perspective. And that's how we've woven this into the fellowship, so we can see that projects start to radically collaborate across previously potentially perceived boundary lines to do something different and create new life-affirming futures. Go to the next slide. So this is really about cultural shift, and we've spoken a lot about this idea of culture change and narrative-led systems change for culture. And we're looking at culture as that deep level, that subterranean level that drives everything else that we see happening on the planet. So it's about ecological consciousness. It's changing worldviews. It's changing the narratives that then shift the way we think. They shift the way we speak. They shift the way we work, how we collaborate, how we think about regeneration, both, human regeneration, planetary regeneration, because they're totally woven. And these 5 pathways emerged as sort of the main images, the main narratives, the main ways that people were working towards thinking about and enacting regenerative futures. And they're interwoven. We'll share what those are. And these are the 5 pathways that emerged through the research. So the first is restoring justice, restoring life. And this is really about decolonization for ecological healing. So you'll see, projects in there that are really focused on that aspect of decolonization and unweaving the colonial way of thinking, colonial mindset, colonial systems. Economies of regeneration. So people that are working on transforming economic systems, work like in the commons, different ways of understanding economy. In Hawaii, we have something called the Aina Aloha Economic Futures Program. So different ways of thinking about economic systems outside of the capitalist way of thinking. Land back to right relationship. So this pathway focuses on land redistribution and ownership models. So many creative things happening. There's a group we've worked with called Sacred Contract that's helping land to own itself. So how do we think about land redistribution, land back, these different models? Bioregional community governance. So that's folks who are focused on community-led governance, decentralized systems, different ways of understanding bioregional governance, those sorts of projects. And then healing the spirit, healing the earth, which I think is often a very overlooked pathway, but it's about the cultural and spiritual shifts, like the shifts within, the things about remembering our earth wisdom, indigenous knowledge systems, ecological regeneration that comes from ancient ways of knowing and being, and what does it look like to tend to that part of the human experience in our relationship with earth. So the way we've organized the fellowship is to select projects that are working in all of these areas equally across the pathways. And then we have folks collaborating across the pathways. So the theory of change here is that you can't really have true, sustainable, lasting, deep regenerative work on the planet without weaving these pathways together. And that's what we're working with in the fellowship. And I'll pass it over to Yael to share some insights because she was deeply involved in this research and see what she might want to add to being part of that.
Thanks, Aubrey. Hey everyone, it's such a pleasure to welcome you all and all of your territories as well. My name is Yael. My lands of origin are the Mediterranean Sea and Mount Carmel in occupied Palestinian territories, or what's known as Israel. I'm calling in today from Kauai. And I'm the co-executive director at Culture Hack Labs, and I support the Rhizome Fellowship mostly from behind the scenes. And this body of work, this research, I think Aubrey did a really great job in sharing. What I would like to do is also point you all to where you can deep dive into this body of work, learn more about the research and what came out of it, as well as there's an incredible contributions from different individuals, thought leaders that have contributed to this issue with their articles. Essentially, the thing that I'd like to share here is that this research that we did was looking at possibility models, right? Models that are literally demonstrating what is possible in terms of regeneration, and these are the pathways that emerged. So we're not inventing the wheel. These examples are alive, they exist, and the intention is, how do we strengthen these possibility models? How do we not only strengthen, but also connect? And so the intention of the fellowship is to support these different possibility models projects that are already very deeply rooted and are showing the way of the world that we know is possible. And then the point of interconnecting them is really what we get into the fellowship. I think I saw some questions as well saying, what if the project overlaps? That's the point. I think we want to see the overlapping, and where there isn't overlapping, really cultivate those opportunities for connections and co-learning. So we are strengthening these capacities within the individual projects as well. So what we would ask in terms of the fellowship is choose one that you feel your project or your collective or your organization is really wanting to represent, and we'll be focusing on the collaborative aspects and strengthening the other aspects in the fellowship as well.
Perfect. Thank you, Yael. Beautiful point. Yeah, so choose the one that feels most resonant because it'll all be interwoven through the fellowship. Now we're going to share a video with you before we do some next steps and then closing. Thanks, Betty.
In times of ecocide and genocide, climate crisis and the rise of fascism, narratives can be pathways for systems change. The violence against the earth and its peoples is the outcome of hundreds of years of monocultures, narratives about who belongs, who decides, what has value, what counts as growth, and the endless bureaucracy of the self. These systems of meaning were imposed, and they can be dismantled. The rhizome is an underground structure connecting root to root, decentralizing knowledge, a web of life. Is the metaphor and the strategy, a global network of narrative practitioners dedicated to challenge the assumptions of capitalist modernity and cultivating new, ancient, and emerging narratives, pathways for regenerative futures. These pathways emerge from a deep questioning in a time where change is measuring metrics, likes, carbon capture, tokens of techno-optimism and market-driven solutions, while oppressive structures remain intact. True regeneration requires interwoven conditions for systems change: justice, economics, governance, land, and spirit. Change is a pathway, not an outcome. Advocating for collective ownership and stewardship of land. returning it into communities rather than leaving it in the hands of corporations and colonial logics.
What is the nature of reality if you're not at the center of it? And what kind of choices might we be making if we understand that, in fact, that is an absolute illusion?
Extremist governments from the right are also taking the power in Europe. So the funding, it seems to be reduced. Indigenous movements do not have the legal infrastructure that these big donors are requiring.
But it has to do with right relationships to the land where we live. It has to do with the communities, with connection, and the right relationship with the original inhabitants of the land where we live.
We want people who are doing justice work to think about the future of the world, the types of policies they want, the norms that they want, from the perspective of being in conversation with the river, not live on top of the river.
Narratives, stories, myths are kind of the red thread of the history of humanity. And it is by telling stories that we make sense of the world around us, our place in it, that we make sense of our relationships.
Moving away from extractive growth-centered economies toward regenerative circular models that prioritize community resilience, food sovereignty, and ecological well-being.
Gift economies are inherent to us as Africans. We had gift economies before colonization, and we thought this was a good way to get people thinking of how else could economies look like. Our project, our hack, is doing that on a bigger scale, and with the intention now of expanding the idea of freedom and expanding the idea of economies.
We're trying ultimately to change this implicit assumption of I am what I buy to I am because we are. That our wealth is in our relationships, that our wealth is in the land, our wealth is in our culture.
And we want to redefine wealth and start defining it as health, as community, as people coming together.
Shifting the dominant narrative from extractive agriculture towards regenerative, and using storytelling as a powerful tool. You cannot do the work of system change without narrative.
So it's really about connecting the grassroots on the ground, the folks working on the ground, to this broader movement to shift to a different economic system.
So I think it really is starting to create the opportunity to present alternative ways of being and ways of living and alternative economies that, become more and more viable in folks' minds and hearts the more uncomfortable things get.
The full cohort gathered in Costa Rica. 21 projects, 5 pathways, 1 week, from all corners of the world. This is where the process becomes embodied. Fellows brought their hacks, half prototyped, field tested, fragile and brave, and shared them with a room full of people who understood in their bones what it takes to work in systems change, in ourselves and in our communities. What was revealed that week was not only strategy, it is a living network, a rhizome spreading. Ecological restoration and social justice are inseparable. You cannot heal ecosystems without addressing the colonial and capitalist exploitation that damaged them.
In order to empower against very different enemies, be it a state that is kind of abusing its power, being a far-right actor that is kind of coming in and kind of taking space and kind of bringing violence with its messaging, or be it a neoliberal project that's trying to impose its own hegemony. It's building also narrative infrastructure.
I see us being respected as queer indigenous people, and also working with the memory of our Abujan, and in that way we achieve justice for ourselves and for them.
E a Guanabara, por ser lugar de encruzilhada, lugar encruzilístico desde sempre, ele também é uma nave propulsora, promotora de encontros pelo mundo. Assim. Isso já está acontecendo aqui agora.
Que somos 18 mujeres y brigadistas que tenemos el objetivo de dar un abordaje a la problemática del fuego desde un enfoque ecotransfeminista.
De nombrar lo que existe, lo que nos da vida, con lo que nos relacionamos, de lo que comemos, que todo eso para mí es el monte, para darte cuenta que no puedes vivir sin eso.
promoting decentralized participatory governance structures that empower communities to manage their resources in alignment with ecological limits, organized around land, not borders.
Climate crisis is not really about carbon emissions. It's about the broken relations between humans and nature. It's about the broken relations between communities and their ecosystems, and the broken relations between our economic system and the living world.
Viene de haber enfrentándose al monte, por lo tanto todo lo que es ordenar la naturaleza, tenerlo todo cortado, y después estamos como muy huérfanos de una profundidad de conexión con la tierra, de unos rituales, de la medicina de las plantas, del honrar, ¿no?, el lugar donde vivimos.
¿Y qué significa, ¿no?, que regenerar nuestro territorio? O sea, que es un proceso de, estamos en un proceso de aprendizaje.
Healing our sense of belonging, our relationship to place, helping remember, that there is that, and that how that can also influence how we restore our ecosystems, especially in the backdrop of the polycrisis.
We really want to bring transition communities and change makers to the public sphere, tell the world that they exist and they've been there for so long, and that there's a lot of knowledge, tools and things to do, and the change is possible yet.
The Culture Hack method is a tool to navigate between islands of coherence, sometimes calling for data and logic, sometimes calling for creativity and spirit. With a sky full of questions in times of uncertain truth, how do we achieve justice and ontological shift together? Narratives shape what we believe is possible. They determine who gets to act and who gets to imagine. When systems collapse, the question is not only what structures to build, but how we build them, what we learn along the way, what stories emerge from those paths. Reconnecting with spiritual and cultural practices that honored Earth, challenging the disconnection and alienation that drives exploitation, and remembering what it means to belong.
Is that I do think the core sickness and what leads to this is our ontology. Like, our worldview, our way of being is separate, it's materialism, it's reductionist, it justifies extraction and commodification, and it's just life-denying.
And so Culture Hack has been incredibly supportive with helping me understand how to form narrative, how to understand audience, how to understand frames and metaphors, and also like how do you hack that system.
Tools and language again to unpack some of those things and to really imagine, like we were talking about, different ways of being, different ways of thinking.
A natural given right to decide who we are for ourselves. You can choose what to do with that, but this is a community where we can learn and share about that.
And then just coming into my own identity as I got older, as a queer and trans person, and how that managed to affect my world as well. Hopefully through reconnecting to grief, reconnecting through that embodiment in the spirit, then we can also reconnect to the larger picture bigger than ourselves.
Liberation is not separate from the liberation of all beings. This is the heart of the Bodhisattva path. This is the heart of the Bodhisattva vow. So that we do that on every level that we can until all beings are free from suffering within, from suffering without, including transforming the systems of oppression as they are in this world during the polycrisis.
A network of narrative practitioners that can seed regenerative futures is hope. If you're a narrative practitioner, storyteller, land defender, artist, hacker, researcher, ready to challenge the dominant systems, the Rhizome is for you.
For the people, we can lose sight of it all when the darkness inside us can make us feel so small. I see your true colors shining through.
This is not a story about what's coming. It's a story about what it's already here. Together, we Rhizome.
Amazing. I always love seeing all the fellows. So wonderful to have you all here with us in this first call. This is just a reminder of the next steps. The second open session will be next week, and an apology for those who weren't able to get in at the beginning, thank you for persisting. We had an issue with the large meeting Zoom setting, so that will be fixed for next week. Our second session will include some fellows from the last cohort, so you'll get to hear directly from them about their experience and their case studies. We'll answer more specific questions about the fellowship itself, but there are also the webpage right here that's linked. We'll share this whole PDF of this presentation afterwards with all the links. And there's a link to the application if you'd like to get ahead and start that. Deadline's April 16th, but we ask that you must see both open sessions, either in the recording or live. And those are our next steps. I'm really excited to have had you here today. We've got one more slide. Resources. So just to offer plenty of resources for anyone who wants to dive deep, understand more of what we're talking about, FAQs, the pathways research, lots of information that we have. And the question had been asked about sharing and attribution. All of our materials are open source with attribution. So yeah, we're really about just increasing capacity in the world for narrative-led systems change. So please have at it. And there should be plenty of information there. Yes, this will be emailed. I see that in the chat. We'll send all of these resources and this PDF with all the links. So you'll have all of that and the recording as well. So inspiring to be with you all. Always so uplifting to feel the sort of vibration of all of us holding the planet with our shared intention for life-affirming futures and culture change. So thank you for being you and persisting in all the work that you do. We're really grateful.
Thank you for coming, and we see you in the next call. And please pass the voice, pass it along.
The application is open anyway. If you already know what your process or your project is, you can already apply. So we will send everything, and everything will be uploaded into culturehack.io/Rhizome. See you in the next.
Bye.
Wakamatika, nitotla, lamumonemaka, tlakit negedwalas, makita